Hello there and thank you very much for joining us. Top flight football clubs will meet later this week as plans to resume the Premier League season gather pace. Project Restart could mean a potential date of June the 8th to begin games again. It comes as Arsenal and Brighton opened their training grounds to players today, but under strict coronavirus distancing measures. Our sports editor Dan Rowan joins me now to talk about this. Dan, what needs to happen then for the league to restart as early as possible?
Evening, Gavin. Well, I think first and foremost, the Premier League and indeed the rest of football would need approval from government. And that really hinges on a number of things, not least more extensive testing, but I think also a relaxation of the social distancing rules that we've seen in place now for some weeks. Look, there's no doubt that government ministers are keen on helping football to return as soon as possible, I think for two reasons. Firstly, I think they recognise its importance as an industry and the level to which the broadcasting revenue that flows into the sport trickles down to other parts of it lower down the Premier League. But I think secondly, they also believe that it would act as a morale booster to people after several weeks of lockdown if some kind of football could be played behind closed doors, which would be available, of course, on television. So what does that mean? Well, there's still a number of questions that have to be answered around where exactly matches would take place. Would they be in quarantine, sealed off venues? That seems to be the direction of travel. But if so, whereabouts would they be? I think there's two areas of concern. One is health and medical. How does the sport guarantee that the safety and the health of those taking part, not just players, but also the other personnel that would have to be at a match, even one behind closed doors? There'd be several hundred people there. Would that involve heat scanners, obviously much more testing, and various other hygiene standards as well? And then I think there's more of a moral question. How would it look if professional footballers are back playing while other people are still in lockdown? And I think that's why I say that it does require some progress being made elsewhere. There's 5 key tests that have to be met according to government, and clearly the lockdown has to be relaxed to some extent. There's also a concern, I think, as well, about whether or not people would be concerned if testing, for example, was diverted towards sport and football in particular, if not enough people already have them in the general public or on the front line of health services. And also, if, for example, sport resumed and there were titles awarded, would that encourage fans to congregate outside stadia? And that would mean, therefore, emergency services, policing being diverted. That would also be, of course, the case if a player was injured at a sporting fixture. Scott Duxbury, the Watford chief executive, was asked about all this earlier on today. Here's what he had to say.
I feel uncomfortable at this stage, even talking about football as a narrative, because there are people dying every day. There are stresses on the NHS, and that has to be our priority. Do I want to resume football? Absolutely. So when it's safe and the government says it's absolutely fine for players and all the support staff that follow football to return, then I'm 100% behind that.
So Dan, football looking to get back on track then, but what about other sports? How close are they to returning?
It depends on the sport, Gavin. I think some, like racing, have already published some of their ideas about how they could return, and maybe they're one of the sports that you could see back sooner rather than later. But I think for others, it looks more problematic. There's two processes, effectively, which are linked that are currently going on. There is a cross-sport process, a consultation across all of the Olympic, the Paralympic and the professional sports, which is feeding into a smaller working group of representatives. Now, that met for the first time last Thursday. It was chaired by the CEO of UK Sport, the funding agency, Sally Munday, and they are looking at different ways to which they can advise the sports on how they can get their athletes back training in the first instance, as opposed to actually competing. There was a smaller number of professional sports, football, rugby, cricket, racing, who have been asked to send their senior medical officials to another meeting, which will meet for the first time, I understand, later this week, which will be perhaps a bit more advanced, looking at how exactly competition can be resumed and seasons actually get back underway. Now, of course, as you've said, we've seen the likes of Arsenal, Brighton, West Ham opening their training bases today for players to get back and try and get fit individually. So that's already beginning in football, but that's actually going to be looking at the next stage, actually resuming seasons. But as I say, some caution has to be borne in mind, because ultimately these plans can be discussed training centres can be opened up, but it all depends ultimately on much more testing and progress being made and government approval, and that isn't guaranteed at this point.
Dan Roan, thank you very much.